Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today. Yes, we still have a podcast. Yes, there still is a host chair. We were just talking off podcast about getting our mojo back. I know we keep coming in episodes saying that that's happening. It will. And I'm very pleased today to be joined by two members of the team that are going to bring their A game today, because they always bring their A game. And so I'm going to start with Eric Rush. How you doing this evening, Eric?
I'm great, Don. Good to be back.
Good to be back. Good to see you too. And also with Mr. Chris Coppola. You know, Chris, probably a good idea for you to say hi to the good people.
Hi to the good people.
Yeah. It is an unreleased episode yet. It'll probably actually go out after this one, but it's already been recorded. Eric Bond and I did an episode, and we were doing the opening there, and I set him up so he could say that. I said, but be forewarned, Chris's lawyer sent me a cease and desist letter from anybody else saying hi to the good people, so don't go there. So you'll hear that eventually at some point for an episode that's not out there yet. So as we get back into the mood here, we were just talking off podcast, which, by the way, is one of our favorite things to do. That's part of the reason we like doing this thing, is we like bringing these musings to you, but we like visiting with each other. And there's multiple recurring themes on our podcast here. One of them is Alexis's love for English history. That's a well-known recurring theme on the podcast. We could easily distract ourselves now by starting a barbecue discussion, because that will be the thing that never gets fully resolved on this podcast until some people get into their right mind. But that's a whole other discussion for a whole other time. And then the third thing we were talking about off podcast is we'll just go out there. We try not to be political, but it's a fair thing to say, Eric, we are not a fan of which American president probably on this podcast.
We're pretty anti-Wilson. And, and Woodrow Wilson gets a lot of credit as an American president, mostly for the League of Nations and sort of the aftermath of World War I. But, when we really analyze him, we're not fans. And whether, and we, as podcast hosts, we run the gamut of current American politics, and we view that as a strength of our podcast. But, we're pretty much on the same page with not really caring much for Wilson.
Yeah, I with the start of baseball season, I think most folks know that I'm a big baseball fan, and looking at that, if you looked at presidential sabermetrics for Wilson, I don't think he would score out on some of the more popular things that are there in terms of how we would rate. I think he is overrated because maybe he has a nice batting average, but his peripherals aren't necessarily that good, kind of thing, if I'm putting it in the right context here.
And to be fair, Don, he had some really slow pitches in 1912. So
yeah,
that goes into it.
Yeah, there's a difference between baseball and softball, right?
At that point, T-ball.
Well, there you go. Yeah, you put it on the tee. Although this is an aside, I won't get us pulled down that. One of the things I did when I was in college was I umpired amateur baseball in the area. It was a nice college gig. Ended up calling a lot of T-ball games, and don't underestimate the quality of ball you can see at the T-ball level. You can see some interesting things there, even when the ball sits on a tee. That's all I'm saying. Our point of departure today, though, is not going to be about Wilson. We will end up there. That's why I mentioned that, because I think we will end up getting there. But we're actually going to take advantage of, I think, Eric, we're probably going to do a spinoff podcast. It may not appear very often, but it's going to be Eric Talks Presidential Health, because we find ourselves coming back time and time again to these things because of your background and how it intersects with history and politics. But the history of American presidential assassinations, the first place that most of us go in our head, I think, are Lincoln and Kennedy. We forget some of the others, but William McKinley was a victim of a presidential assassination, and it's a pretty pivotal moment in American history in a lot of ways, which is what we're going to talk about today. So our point of departure is going to be, what if McKinley had survived the 1901 assassination. I am not even going to try to pronounce his assassin's name. Chris may be able to go there because he's better at those combinations of consonants that come together than I am.
Yes, because basically, when Eric and I do our spin-off podcast, it should be entitled Eric and Chris Kill Off Historical World Leaders. Yeah.
I would host that podcast, Chris. I would listen to that podcast.
Yes. Leon Czolgosz was a member of the anarchist ideological spectrum that was very big at this point.
Right.
I mean, honestly, I think when we do Eric and Chris Kill Off Historical World Leaders, we could probably do in the first season of it in like a 10-year time span around here, because you've got an Italian king, you've got French prime ministers, Russian ministers. There's even some suggestion that the Black Hand that started World War I had some of these anarchist influences in it. So throughout Europe and now America, and we'll get into this a little bit, America is becoming part of the wider world. This is one of those things that's happening all over, is anarchists are killing world leaders.
Right. And ultimately, for different reasons, but we ultimately get to an assassination that leads off World War I. That's not directly along those lines, but assassinations were big at the turn of the century, from the 19th and 20th century, I guess is the point here. So I would listen to that podcast too. Even if it weren't you guys, I would listen to that podcast. I will definitely listen to that podcast if it's the two of you. So we were trying to figure out where our point of departure will be. And, we don't want to spend too much time on the historical what did, but I know Eric can walk us through that. He was shot at an exposition in Buffalo.
Yeah.
In fact, I did learn this. I can't remember. I may have mentioned this on podcast. I don't remember if it was someplace else. Somebody told me that the marker for where this happened sits in like the median of a street in Buffalo suburbia, because it was a temporary exhibition site. Was where the Pan America, or I think it was the Pan American Expo was being held. And so it was like tents and in a big field, which eventually became a residential area. And so there's a small marker in the middle of the median in this suburban area that if you know to look for, this is where McKinley was shot. It's just, just down the street from somebody who lives there or right across from them. So he's in Buffalo for that exposition, and he's assassinated. But he doesn't die immediately. This is not, an immediate death from an assassin's bullet. So, Eric, do you want to walk us through just a little bit of the what did, so we can depart off of it and then get to the fun stuff, the anti-Wilson stuff that we'll eventually get to, right?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to do that, Don. And McKinley was shot twice at close range. And, it's interesting the way it happened, but because I think the intention was probably to shoot him twice in the chest. But he was shot once in the chest, and that bullet bounced off of his sternum. And so that would have been a very surface wound, which probably would have been, infection at that point was a problem, no question. But, assuming the best of care at that time, well, we will assume that wound, even in our fork in time would have been fine. But then the second bullet went into his left upper abdomen. So what's there? What is real estate in the left upper abdomen? Two organs for the most part, the stomach and the spleen. And so had he been shot in the spleen, he probably would have died much, much quicker. That is a blood rich organ. If your spleen is ruptured or in some way, significantly perturbed, it is very easy to bleed out and die very quickly just of shock. But he didn't. And so it's pretty clear. And it's also clear from the autopsy. We have some other information that supports the idea that Wilson was shot in the stomach. And it was a wound that happened in the front and the back of the stomach. And then he was taken to surgery pretty quickly. And I think Don and Chris, after I'm done, with my discussion, feel free to chime in. But there was a surgeon who was pretty nearby that offered some aid. But interestingly enough, there was a different surgeon who counseled on the case, after the operation. And this was a surgeon by the name of Roswell Park. Dr. Park was a very gifted surgeon, and he had a history with Buffalo, and he has a research laboratory that is now known as the Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center, that is also in Buffalo. But he was in surgery at the time of McKinley being shot. So what if he weren't? What if Dr. Park were just, and I don't know what he would have been doing in 1901 when McKinley was shot, but let's just assume he happened to be at home and available, and he didn't have to finish the operation that he was engaged in, and he would have been able to be in Buffalo and and been able to be present to attend President McKinley and take him to surgery. Because I think if a gifted surgeon such as Roswell Park had performed surgery, I think McKinley would have had a chance. And so our point of departure is, what if that chance worked out in our favor and McKinley survived?
Right. And so we are a year into McKinley's second term. He was
originally elected in 1896, reelected in 1900, and he was just into his second term.
Yeah, and he had picked up a new vice president in his second term because, as we were talking about off podcast, the vice president, who I didn't even look up, and I won't even look up here because if he doesn't come to mind, probably good reason that he doesn't come to mind, but he had died during McKinley's first term, and there was no provision, like we've talked about so many times. A recent episode, we actually talked about presidential succession here and what that meant. There's no provision that, and Roosevelt was a war hero coming off the Spanish-American War. So it was, I think, Chris, you described it as they parked Roosevelt in the VP slot for the benefits of the vote, but also to keep Roosevelt from being, he's the VP. He's under a little bit of party control sitting there. And so McKinley has 3 years left on his term if he survives. Mm-hmm. And we obviously, the two things that I pointed out is we don't have the ascendancy of TR in 1901. That's one of the things from the departure, but we get 3 more years of McKinley. So the question is, what happens during the 3 more years of McKinley? Is that significant in some way? And as we were talking about, I think we're going to discover a couple of very interesting ripples here that are interesting ripples to think through. The only other thing I was going to mention, the other possibility might have been, as I was reading through some of the background here, one of the things that was being shown off at the exposition was one of the first X-ray machines, apparently, Eric. Mm-hmm. And so somebody might have actually taken, I guess the issue was finding the second bullet. And so, one of the things that might have happened was, the other way we could have broken this point of departure is not Dr. Park being available, but somebody said, hey, we've got this way of maybe finding it over here with this machine, why don't we go and do that? And maybe they would have found it that way, maybe they wouldn't have. But in either way, it's the 5th of September when he's shot, it's the 13th of September when he dies. There was a period of time, so much so that the cabinet, members of the cabinet and Roosevelt, who had traveled to Buffalo, everything looks good, and they leave Buffalo. Roosevelt takes off on a trip to the Adirondacks, and other members of the cabinet go. So again, the expectation was that he was going to survive. So I like our point of departure. So we're going to give Dr. Park the credit because it sounds like a good place to go. So we have a living McKinley. Before we go down the alternate path, I guess, what is Roosevelt best known for in the real timeline when he takes over here? It would be a good point of departure to talk a little bit about the impact of Roosevelt taking over for McKinley before we start talking about what doesn't happen as a result of that.
Chris, do you want to take this?
So I'll give a couple of things that Roosevelt kind of starts with. First is the Bull Moose Party, which I'm sure we're going to get to in a couple. In terms of presidential policies, this was kind of a time of political realignment, and Roosevelt represented the progressive wing of the Republican Party. That's another, other than just he's a star to put him as a vice president, this is a way to try and reach out to some of those progressive forces. So we're talking about limits on working conditions, pure food and drug acts, things like that. Panama Canal. Those are the major highlights. Is that pretty fair?
I think so. I mean, I think so. I certainly think of, of Roosevelt associated with the Panama Canal being a good example of that. And one of the things we were talking about too is one of the areas that McKinley and Roosevelt would not have agreed upon probably was the nature of manifest destiny / American imperialism, right? I mean, they probably didn't see eye to eye on that.
We actually did a previous episode on the Battle of Manila that basically said that if Roosevelt wasn't very lucky, he probably would have been, I'm not sure if Undersecretary of the Navy is impeachable, but court-martial.
Fireable and removable from office or removable from position, right?
With criminal.
It was pretty egregious.
It was bad.
It was pretty egregious. And the reason why things turned out the way they did is because nothing succeeds like success. And
it worked.
It worked. And when you win, like, all sins are forgiven. Mm-hmm. And so, what did Kennedy say? Victory has 1,000 fathers and, defeat is an orphan. And that was very well said. And I think applies very well to that.
Now that we're talking about overrated presidents, that being,
and I will say, I've gone on record, and I am a Kennedy fan, and I still agree with that. I like Kennedy, and I still think he's overrated.
But the point of the issue here is Roosevelt wanted to get into the Spanish-American War so much that he basically put his career on the line. Yeah. And sent the American Asiatic Squadron down to try and take the Philippines. At the same time, McKinley is fighting to some extent to keep us out of this war. He really does not want.
He is not imperialist. He does not want any part of this.
Right. He very much wants to keep us out. So while the war is over by this point, I think one of the wars is over. There's another one going on that's often forgotten.
I was fixing to say, the Spanish-American War is over, but the things that result from the Spanish-American War are still going on. It's it's what happens afterwards.
And so, do we want to go your fork or do we want to do mine? How do you want to handle it?
I want to do both of them because
I do too. Because I really like your fork, Chris, but I think my fork is more institutionalist with what happened, and I think your fork is I think no less probable, but feels like a little bigger deviation. Is that fair to say?
Okay. I don't know. So long story short,
we'll let the listeners decide because I like both forks.
Yes.
So my fork is, and again, we are a podcast that does not like Woodrow Wilson. And so my thought is you have TR in the vice presidency in the 1901 election. And so he has served a term as vice president. McKinley there are no term limits, but there's still Washington's tradition. And I cannot imagine McKinley being who he is, bucking Washington's tradition. He would not run for a third term. He would have been done after 2. And
both of us agree that far.
What's that?
Both of us agree that far.
Yeah, McKinley was not that kind of person to buck that tradition. He would have bowed out after 2. I think that's true. So my fork is that, TR easily wins the nomination in 1904 and wins the White House and serves 2 terms in, 1904, 1908. And then in 1912, instead of a 3-way race that was won by Woodrow Wilson, you now have we'll say a de facto term limited TR. Let's just say he goes along with tradition and says, okay, I've served my 2 terms. It's 1912. I'm going to handpick my successor. Well, who was his handpicked successor? William Taft. And so whether that happens in 1908 or 1912, maybe isn't as big of an issue. And so in my fork, you have that 1912 is not a 3-way Republican, Democrat, Bull Moose. It is a straight Republican, Democrat, and the Republican is William Howard Taft. And so he is in a pitched battle against Woodrow Wilson. And I don't think Wilson would win.
And the comment that I would make to that, I was looking through some of the things as we were talking about that earlier, and the Electoral College lock that McKinley had helped solidify for the Republicans, it's hard to say what could have changed that. Certainly, eventually it does change. Ultimately, it only changes because of the Great Depression. Is ultimately the Wilson win when a third party is and splits the electorate on the Republican side, and then a depression. These are the two things that it takes to bust open that Electoral College lock. So,
right.
I think it's a fair thing to say, we can debate or discuss who the candidate might be, but the presumption always has to be there. Everything being equal, a Republican is going to win the presidency through this series unless there's something unusual that happens as a result of the fork. I would just make that as a blanket statement. I think that's a fair thing. Which one, becomes an interesting question, but I think that's a fair thing to say.
Yeah, I agree. And so then you could even take it further. And so you've got 1912. So, in my fork, you have, William Howard Taft, who is president in 1912 and is up for re-election. He lived until 2030 in our timeline, or
1930.
Oh my gosh, Chris, what am I doing? He lived until
William Howard Taft. If you're listening to this, we think you were an underrated American president, and you still got 7 years to live, my friend.
I would hang out with William Howard Taft. He lived until 1930 as the in the Supreme Court. Oh my gosh, I have such trouble with years, guys.
I do too, which is really bad for being part of a history podcast. It really works against you.
I know. I don't know. I need to go to remedial history school or something. So anyway, so he survives long enough, let's just say, to run for re-election in 1916, and he certainly, despite his weight and that being the butt of jokes, he is certainly healthier than Woodrow Wilson at that point. And so let's assume that we have a World War I that is in full swing, 1916, William Howard Taft, what happens?
I don't know the answer to that question. And the reason I don't know the reason I don't know the answer to that question in a lot of ways is I even think back to what actually happened in the real timeline, which is, Wilson campaigns about staying out of the war, and then boom, we're in it. And, we know some of the reasons around that. In fact, recent episode that you guys were part of, which I really enjoyed as a listener. One of the cool things about having a team for podcast now is how I get to be a listener to the podcast. But I don't know, Eric. I get the sense there might have been a little bit more of a bend towards isolationism there, but I don't know if I just assume that just, to be different than what really happened in the timeline or not. I think I just don't know.
I think the trend is there, and I will be interested in what Chris thinks as well. I think the trend is there. I don't think Taft is necessarily a doctrinaire anything, let alone a doctrinaire isolationist. So I think that there is a narrative to be made for a way that Taft could get involved in the war. Now, what I will say is, I think that for Taft, I think he is uninterested in creating a new international order. I think, do I think Taft had a soft spot for our British allies, our French allies? Maybe. I think he would prefer that, democracies be present in Europe. Yeah, I think that was probably true. But I don't think he wanted to remake the world order. I think he was very content with, Europe being relatively friendly and especially relatively business friendly, and then having a prosperous United States that had a lot of influence over the Western Hemisphere. I think Taft was perfectly happy with that. I don't know, Chris, what do you think?
I definitely think he was very interested in American interest in the Western Hemisphere.
Yes.
I would say to the exclusion of Europe. I'm not sure that he does get involved when he does.
Okay.
I think a lot of it comes down to Wilson chasing windmills.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's also, what does the press do with events that happen, and these are things that were made a lot of, like the sinking of the Lusitania. I mean, like a lot was made of that. Did that force us into the war? Absolutely not. Did it
because it happened 2 years before we actually did join.
Right. But could you call back on that for some context? Sure.
The one thing I would say is I feel like Taft had more political experience.
Yeah.
He had been Secretary of War under McKinley.
Yeah.
I think if Taft, looking at what actually happened, it feels a little bit like Wilson. I honestly do not know if he knowingly lied in the 1916 election or if he declares war within a month of getting inaugurated, almost in a fit of pique. And I feel like Taft is a little bit more of a professional statesman.
He is. He definitely is.
So that when he does get the United States fully involved, if he does, we're more prepared. He's done his homework.
So let me just throw this out there, because this is what was running through my head. And I'm fascinated by this because I've spent a lot more time in the last year looking at World War I. I sort of feel like it was the hole in my American global war education, because we sort of skip over it, I think, in a lot of the ways that we approach it from American history, because we don't know how to attack it.
Me too, Don. And I have been fortunate to learn from Professor Chris Coppola on World War I, and it has been a great experience.
So my
5
question,
out of 5 stars on Yelp. Do recommend.
There you go. So my question is, in the scenario here, let's say we're talking about Taft being in the president's chair in 1914 when the war starts.
Right.
Is there, and not just in the inevitability of post 1916, what happened in the real timeline with Wilson, is there a path here where the U.S. sits this out?
Yes, there is. There absolutely is. And I've talked about this on podcasts before, and I'll be interested in everybody's opinion. I firmly believe that one of the reasons why we got involved in World War I is because so much of the financing of the United Kingdom for the war was American. That a lot of the debt was held not in London but in New York. And I firmly believe that is one reason why we got involved in the war. If that can be prevented, if the American financing is either absent or much less, I think there's absolutely a case to be made for us not to be in the war. Chris, what do you think about that?
I somewhat agree with that. My question is, how do you, thinking about the political economic modality here of laissez-faire capitalism, which this brand of the Republican Party, and I do think it's important to say this brand of the Republican Party was committed to, I don't know if I see them putting in controls to stop that. I'm not sure. What are you suggesting? Kind of a neutrality act that bans financial dealings with?
I don't know that I feel like that's likely. That's a good point, Chris. Like, can you stop this by statute? You could. Does that feel very, congruent with the time? Not really. I think there would have to be a reason why it was less attractive, or that you would use some sort of soft power.
I absolutely have one scenario.
Okay.
I think I mentioned it earlier at the beginning of our Wilson. Like I said, Taft does his homework.
He does. He's very prepared.
In 1911, there's the beginnings of the Mexican Revolution. there's instability in our hemisphere.
Mhm.
We invade the Dominican Republic in 1915.
Yes.
There's a lot of stuff going on closer to home, and the one economic intervention that they are okay with is security policy.
Mm-hmm.
So I think ramping up American defense spending with the Veracruz incident in 1914,
Yes.
with the purchase of the Virgin Islands, with the invasion of the Haiti and the Dominican Republic, that creates a market for those arms and that finance so that it stays domestic. Because if I am JP Morgan, I have a choice. I can bet on Britain and France beating Germany, which is a push.
That's a push. Yeah.
Or I can bet on the United States beating the Dominican Republic, which is a safer bet.
Okay. Oh, okay. I like this. And so because I agree with you, I think the idea of creating some sort of neutrality act where, U.S. banks were banned from taking on British debt that feels like a real reach. And it feels like something that feels like a 2023 interpolation. Whereas I think it is you create a more attractive market.
Or by the way, I would say it's a 1938 interpretation of how we got into it, because the neutrality acts that were passed during the Great Depression to stop that involvement.
So, Chris, if we're doing this, I'm not sure we have a World War II. If we do it this way, right?
Oh, we do. And I have a giant, massive political shift coming.
Okay. So part of the reason I want to go down this path is, my interpretation of the Great War, World War I and World War II, was sort of always there. We've talked about this so many times, how Versailles sets the stage, for all the things that go on with that. But if you somehow alter World War I, you do alter. World War I is the seminal event that lays the groundwork for, I think, the rest of the 20th century, because it's the thing that leads to World War II. World War II leads to the superpower. I mean, the domino effect in history there that starts, with the assassination of an before that, but the trigger event being the assassination of an archduke in the Balkans, leads to the rest of what eventually becomes the American century of all things. And so, to Eric's point, I'm always looking for a way to avoid World War II. Well, if you change World War I think you automatically, by ripple, change World War II. Chris disagrees, I think.
You change it. You don't prevent it.
Okay.
Well, I'm always interested in your concept on this, Chris, because I think it's very hard to prevent World War II. But I think what you do is you change the belligerents and you change the circumstances. And so I think if you have a U.S. is no longer holding British debt and is no longer actively involved in the war, I think France is done. I think the UK can't sustain, and so I think you have a Central Powers victory. I don't know exactly what happens to Austria-Hungary. I think but you have a German Empire that is, clearly the dominant force in Europe. And so I think a lot of it depends on what sort of stipulations do they put on the peace. So, we are not Versailles. And so I'm trying to think of cities that are 20 miles out of Berlin, like Versailles is out of Paris.
Potsdam.
Potsdam. So we have a Potsdam conference, and instead of a Versailles conference where you have Germany and the Central Powers defining the terms. I think the question is how onerous are those terms on France? And I think that, to me, defines what the nature of World War II is.
So I think we're getting kind of close to Kaiserreich here.
Oh, not again, Chris.
Well, hear me. I mean, first, I do believe that a German victory is going to be onerous on France. There is nothing that leads me to believe that it's going to be a white peace with them.
No, it's not a white peace. I completely agree.
It is going to be harsh. France is going to be a revanchist, as probably is Britain. Where I think it gets interesting is its effect on the United States.
Okay, I agree.
The United States, in our scenario, takes that industrial capacity and that finance and rearms and starts bullying around Latin America. The issue is this. What happens to United States trade to Europe with a German victory?
I'm not sure in the long term it changes all that much.
Oh, I think it does, because Germany is going to try and create a continental system.
Well, okay, so we trade with Germany.
No, we're competing with Germany.
So, I mean, absolutely. So we compete with China now, but
Yes.
we still trade with them extensively. And I think culturally we have a lot more. We have a lot more history with the German Empire than we do with them. So, right?
That's true. That's true. But I think what it leads to in the United States is, instead of a conservative 1920s, you get, because you've disrupted it earlier, I think progressivism comes in a big way here.
Now, I agree with that. I'm not sold on the idea that the trade with Germany is the major inciting influence. I look at this as just the kind of the natural pendulum swing in American politics,
and we disrupted the initial switches that happened. So the question is, which party is carrying that mantle? We've had a two-term Roosevelt who was a progressive in his own right,
but was still a Republican. We have a Taft who literally Taft-Hartley is named after. Yeah, and I would consider Taft, to me, Taft is neither terribly conservative nor terribly progressive. I would consider him to be an institutionalist Republican.
He's definitely progressive compared to McKinley.
Well, a lot of people are progressive. Yeah, a lot of people. So I would agree with that. And so, but I think he doesn't come down very firmly on either side of that spectrum to me. But I think what Taft is he's very much an institutionalist.
So do you think Taft wins 1916, 1920? Do we have a Robert La Follette?
That's a pretty big reach.
Okay.
Not to say that we couldn't. So I think Taft loses in 1916. And I don't think it's necessarily because of anything he did wrong. I think at that point you have had 20 years of Republican presidency. I think you have a lot of turmoil abroad. And so I think at this point you simply have fatigue with one party.
So you think, but you're okay and interested with a Taft rearming starting in 1914. So we've got a decent complex.
I think
right up to 1916.
I think that's absolutely reasonable. Yeah, I think you can make a case for that. That if you made that decision in 1914 to rearm, and that a lot of the financing is directed towards particularly Central America and the Caribbean, I could see that. Like, that's not hard to envision at all.
But so who's the Democrat that does win in 1916?
I have a lot of trouble with that. I mean, when does FDR even come in? Because he comes. No. He's not there for a while.
Yeah,
he's not there in 1916. But could he be there in 1928? Yeah.
See, to me, the New Deal and that shift is predicated upon the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Which could be triggered by American goods being shut out of a European continental system.
So are you thinking there is maybe a smaller New Deal that happens in kind of the late teens, early 20s? as a response to that, to all of the what's going on in Europe?
I think that happened. I think there's a continental system. Started with the Potsdam Conference of 1919.
Okay.
It hits the United States because actually, remember, what actually started the Great Depression was the run on German war debt. Dawes planned loans backing German bonds.
True.
So,
I mean, yeah, no, you're right, Chris. But there's no German bonds to, it's a different system. But you're just saying.
But there's whatever leftover capital did wind up going to Britain and France that they're now defaulting on.
Okay, well, because
with that capital lost matched with the market loss.
Because at this point, Britain's in bad shape and France is in very bad shape.
If they're still in it.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. I could buy this. I can buy this, Chris, that you have an earlier and probably more modest New Deal with a different Democrat, or we'll say progressive overall. Mm-hmm. Is it La Follette? Because I mean, did he win any electoral votes outside of Wisconsin?
No, but you're assuming that there's not a national political machine behind him. When he ran for president, he was running as a progressive. If he is the
Democrat
or the Republican, because you're saying the Democrats win in 1916, let's say it's their perennial candidate, William Jennings Bryan. He's not getting us in.
He's not progressive.
But he's not getting us into the war. So the war is playing out the way we're suggesting. The Potsdam Conference is happening, and you're seeing American capital loss and market loss hitting in time for the 1920 election.
So, Chris, you've done a couple of things here. Not only have you you stopped U.S. involvement in World War I, but you've also stopped that party shift that happened around that time, whereby the Republicans became the more conservative party and the Democrats became the more progressive party. You've turned that on its head. And so now you have a more progressive Republican Party in the mold of TR. And you have a much more conservative party of William Jennings Bryan.
Yes.
Very interesting.
And the thing to remember there, Eric, you hit it on the head, is that, eventually the nature of that pendulum concept that I very much believe in terms of American politics in general, particularly American presidential politics, the fact that we have a two-party system, even though third parties arise, is eventually the other party does one of two things. It either adapts as the other party and changes to bring itself back into where it can once again be electorally competitive, or it gets replaced. I mean, those are the two ways that happens.
Yeah.
It either morphs or it gets replaced, because the nature of our political structure with the way elections work is we're going to have predominantly two parties because it's a winner take all system. And that's, you can't survive as a minority third party for long. You either have to supplant or you get your issue supplanted and by the other party trying to make a bigger thing.
And as a hat tip to Alexis, that's literally what is happening in our timeline right during this period in the United Kingdom. The Liberal Party is going the way of the dodo, and Labour is becoming the opposition to the Tories.
Right. No, that's a very good point, and that's interesting. And like so many of these forks, it would be interesting to see this play out further on. I mean, obviously, we've created something. We've created something that I think is plausible, but I think increasingly as we go along, of course, more speculative. And
as the ripples get farther from where the rock entered the pond, they get less distinct, is always the nature of what happens here. But it's amazing. It's, again, this is part of the reason the concept of this podcast even exists for me, is that small things, Dr. Park not being available because maybe the reason he's not available is out on the golf course, and so so he's I don't know why, but
he was actually in surgery, and
but small things of it's not a very large leap, as we talked about at the start here, to imagine McKinley surviving this assassination attempt. That's not that is not a ridiculous notion in terms of what's doing there, but the repercussions of that, because of who's standing in the wings and what happens there with TR's ascendancy and the presidency and all that means. I mean, I think we're gonna along my lines here immediately is I'm probably going to call this episode "No Teddy Bears," but I think that's a good place to go with the title for it. We haven't even got into the TR role here at all because we went off on the other things which are the logical part of that's here, and we talk about this a lot, but there's a reason we talk about this. We're coming back to a part 2 on this. There's a whole other fork to explore here that we didn't even go down because we said we were going to look at Eric's fork and Chris's fork. We haven't gotten into Chris's fork yet because that does deal more with who TR is.
Yeah. And I think the more I think about it, I actually think, don't get me wrong, I think my fork is very interesting and entertaining, but the more I think about it, I think Chris's fork is actually significantly more plausible.
Yeah.
And so I'll be interested in exploring Chris's fork when we do a part 2 of this, because we, P.S. by the way, we're doing a part 2 of this.
Yeah. We were just chatting in the Zoom here on the side. We're going to bring this in for a soft landing because we know we've gone for a while on the one. We're doing part 2, and it'll be an interesting thing, once other members of the team who listen to this are able to be part of that and they're able to chime in, because I know from my experience, I was telling somebody, one of the great joys about, you hear me talk about this all the time, I would actually use this to lead into sort of closing the podcast out here, is the 2 guys that are on my screen right now. I didn't know who they were when I started A Fork in Time. And that's one of the cool things to me about what we've done here. And, it was cool for me to listen to the Wilson episode that you guys referenced there. You guys recorded that. In fact, it was recorded, edited, and loaded. I listened to it actually as a listener. I listened to it on my podcatcher. I didn't even preview what I loaded because I trusted the content from who had done it and loaded it up with Dylan as well. I had to go back and understand what some of the references were I was seeing because we got, you guys were talking about barbecue at the end and stuff like that, but I loaded it up not even knowing that. And to me, that's what's cool here, because the reason I go down that path, circle the building, now I'm back at the front door, is the whole time I'm listening to that, I go, ooh, I haven't thought about that. Ooh, I haven't thought about that. Ooh, I haven't thought about that. And because I wasn't on the recording, I wasn't able to say those thoughts. So I'm actually curious to see what our team comes back around and brings to this. I think it's an interesting topic.
I do think Dylan, especially with William Howard Taft playing into this in some way, and the fact that he just wanted to be a Supreme Court justice.
Yeah.
He really did. So I think his constitutional law is going to be interesting, especially given that this is one of those periods of significant constitutional change in our timeline.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And so hopefully we can get Dylan and any other team members in on part 2, because I think that will be a lot of fun, because I and we're teasing a little bit of what Chris's fork is, but it's a good one.
But you guys know it. Initially when you hear it, it's like are you but then when you marinated
once you hear the context, you'll be like, okay, this is a reasonable fork.
Yeah.
So I'm excited. It'll be a fun discussion which we're planning on doing in the next week or so, right, guys?
Yeah,
I think so.
We'll come back and do that. Actually, as I mentioned earlier, I do have a recording of an episode that'll probably fall in between this one and that one. That'll give us time to record and get it out and actually get our inventory built up a little bit here at some point. By the way, we're going to record a room where it happened here at some point. It'll happen. I just don't know when it's going to happen.
It'll happen.
It'll come back around to it, but we'll certainly come back around to this as a second topic. And again, that leads me in just to saying again how much we enjoy having you guys as listeners. We understand we've been inconsistent. You guys have stuck with us, and some of you even reached out on our Discord server saying, hey, you guys, you still there? Catching up on things and all of that. So we know that we're missed, and we appreciate that. And so we'll be back with that. If you want to learn more about the podcast, if you're new to the podcast, all the back catalog is there on the website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. I will mention it here because it'll show up as a news item there because it needs to be posted. We do have some news from the podcast. The co-founder of the podcast. Oh yeah, she's my daughter too. 2022 is expecting. So I'm taking on this whole new idea about what history is going to be now that I'm thinking about the next generation that's coming along, and that'll be fun stuff there. And so had a chance to see Alexis today. I know she's anxious to get back in and get re-engaged there as well. But we like doing this. We enjoy doing this, and we enjoy that you guys are just there along to listen. And so I mentioned this to say, if you've got feedback, go to the website, go to our Discord server, give us the feedback there. We enjoy talking about this, typing back and forth with listeners there, and we get some good ideas from that. Go ahead, Eric. I'm sorry.
No, absolutely. I was just going to say, the whole team is very excited for Alexis and Jake, and one of these days, one of my missions is to get Jake on the podcast.
Yes.
We think we have a path to do that. He is a big Star Wars fan and a big fan of Godzilla. So we just have to find some way with one of our whimsical kind of things to bring that in. And I'll just mention here the next episode. I'll go ahead and tease the next episode because it's the one that Eric Bond and I recorded last week. It just didn't make it out of the editing room and into the feed. Is an entirely different direction. It talks about Jim Henson and Muppets. We are a diverse group of podcasters here at the end of the day. So you see us all over the place when it's all said and done.
Right on.
You guys have any closing thoughts here before we close it out?
No, we're glad to be back, and we're looking forward to part 2.
I am too. So stay, I think this one's going to be called No Teddy Bears. I don't know what that one's going to be called, but we'll get it there. So on behalf of Chris Coppola, on behalf of Eric Rush, I'm Don getting the sign off here. Thank you for joining us here on A Fork in Time. I'm going to throw to Chris this time with our classic close, which is if you happen along a fork in time, any idea about what to do?
Take it.
I think so. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.